Everyone, welcome. This is one of our highest attended sessions. So thank you, Laura, for being here. This is our weekly Food for Thought policy lecture speaker series that we've done for the past year. We're coming up on our 1-year anniversary. And we welcome distinguished lineup of the EMPA faculty and friends of the program and experts in their fields. And today's topic is going to be hosted by Laura Kavanaugh, First Deputy Commissioner, New York City Fire Department, on the topic of the poison water cooler and workplace gossip as a lever of power. Bill Emick, Professor Emick, is the Executive Director of the program, and he will give Laura a much better introduction than I can give. So just a little bit about housekeeping. The session will be recorded. It will be available as of next week on our website, and I can post that in the chat. Please hold your questions until the end, and then at the end you can type in. I will enable chat. You can type in chat or ask Laura follow-up questions. Be respectful. Keep yourself muted, or I will. And without further ado, Professor Emick, take it away.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you to Valerie and Jeremy, who many of you know, who together have really kept this ship afloat for over a year. And if you haven't gone to the website, please go. I mean, it's an extremely impressive array of individuals and talks and subjects. It's something I'm really, really proud of. There are many things about the EMPA program and the Picker Center and SEPA in Columbia that I'm proud of. But this really stands out as something in the middle of a pandemic where everybody was, not in the best of mind, that we came together and talked about things that were important to us and had a real good dialogue. And the dialogue hasn't gone away. So it's all there, and we're going to keep it there. And it's a great resource. And I also think, frankly, it's a great recruiting device for Valerie, who assembles great people like you guys, many of you, to be part of this program. So without further ado, I need to get to Laura's bio, because it's extremely impressive and something that's close to my heart, because I was at one point an employee of the FDNY, and I also continue to try to be of service through the FDNY Officers Management Institute, which was started right after 9/11. And I'm proud to say is now run by the Picker Center and trains mid-level, soon to be high-level executives in the FDNY for in skills similar to the EMPA program, and Laura, among other things, runs that. She is the highest ranking woman at the FDNY. She's the second woman in history to be the first deputy commissioner. I thought you were the first, but maybe I'm mistaken. It's quite possible.
Marlene Gold in the 90s, I have to give her credit, was the first.
Second woman, youngest person. She is number 2 in an enormous agency of billions of dollars and 15,000 employees in the busiest emergency service fire EMS department, certainly in the United States, probably anywhere except perhaps China. And even there, I think it's bigger. So it's a huge responsibility. She's been doing it for quite a while and doing it really well. She has a long history of public service. She worked at City Hall before she came to the FDNY. She's also been a management consultant, working in campaigns and with community-based organizations, nonprofits, unions. She's worked on presidential campaigns, mayoral campaigns, congressional campaigns, and local campaigns. She's had educational stints at the Naval Postgraduate School for Homeland Defense at Stanford. Her undergraduate degree is at Whittier College, and very soon she will be a graduate of the EMPA program, of which many of us are a part. She's one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life, one of the smartest, one of the most powerful. And on top of everything else, she runs the marathon and also some of the stair climbs that are done to benefit firefighters and their families. So an amazing character. So Laura, without further ado, please take over. Her paper is fascinating. If you haven't read it already, it's on the website. Please read it.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for that exceptionally flattering introduction. Much appreciated. I also want to thank two people I think I see on this Zoom who are the ones who actually told me that when I talked to them about this topic, that it was interesting and I thought it might not be. One is my mentor, Jimmy Briggs, and the other is a professor at the Columbia School of Journalism, Todd Gitlin. So thanks to them for reassuring me as I went down this path many, many months ago on this topic and telling me that there might be some people who needed to hear about this. And thank you, obviously, to you and SEPA for hosting me and hopefully graduating me in a week, which I'm very excited about. So with further ado, I actually have a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's okay, Val, if I share my screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I made you co-host so you can share your screen.
All right, can you guys see? Okay. So to start off, I just want to talk a little bit about, why are we here today? Why focus on gossip and why with this group? And I think,
Laura, sorry, just to interrupt. Just go into presentation mode.
Okay.
In your PowerPoint.
Better?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
Why are we here today? Why this topic? Why now? Why at SEPA? And a few reasons for me that I think this is really important. And first and foremost, to say, SEPA is a program for executives or future executives, and so there is a whole realm of discussion around discourse and why it matters in public life. And there's no way we could get into all of that right now. But what I tried to focus this presentation on and my paper on is as executives at SEPA and probably moving on from SEPA into the world, what should we know about this and how can we tackle it as executives? So, this is I'd say just a sliver of what there is out there, but I think it's important because of what this program is and who we're talking to today. I think it's also exceptionally important because, we all talk about reforming organizations in public life, and we all talk about diversifying leadership at the top levels of organizations. I think the last year and the last 24 hours have just emphasized that more than I ever could. And yet we still struggle to actually achieve that change. And especially we struggle to see that change at the top of organizations. And so one reason that's why I'm so interested in this course of study is, to me, it's all one problem and it's all intertwined. And we all as leaders need to understand all the pieces that contribute to these barriers to change. And so, this is one of them and one that I'm very focused on. I also think, some very high profile lived experiences, Meghan Markle and Britney Spears being, I think, the two most well-known that have happened over the course of the last few months, have really crystallized what a lot of people in public life, especially women, have known for a long time, but have had trouble articulating how corrosive those effects really were. And so I felt that this was a pertinent time, and that coverage had actually helped me frame out why this is such an important topic and why something like gossip that we might see as minor or silly can actually have extremely detrimental real life impacts, as you saw with those two women. And of course, in the course of my research and my own lived experience, as you might be able to guess, that is not limited to those women. It is true of almost any woman who has any type of profile in public life, which is a near necessity in this day and age as a leader. And then finally, one thing that we'll talk about further in the topic is that organizations perpetuate themselves as much unofficially as they do officially. And so there's a lot of really well-warranted discussion about the official ways that we change organizations, mentorship programs, leadership pipelines, rules and regulations, but a whole bunch of how we build organizational life is unofficial. And that's true outside of work as well. How we interact as people drives much of how we operate and how things change, and especially how we frame problems and solutions. And so I felt like this was maybe under-discussed and understudied, the unofficial ways that organizations perpetuate themselves. So that's part of why I decided to explore this topic and write this paper today. So moving on, why is gendered gossip in particular so harmful? And there's three main themes, and we'll dive into each of these in each of the sections. But first and foremost, leadership is still defined as a male trait. All of the research backs this up. The lived experience of most women backs this up. And this is actually true whether or not men are good leaders. So since we were just speaking about the governor, I think that's a perfect example, is even when he is being perceived as a bad leader, he's still being spoken about in terms that are powerful. He's a powerful bully. He's a controlling bully. He's still very much in charge, despite what we might think of him. And that you see that across all discourse about leadership, that it is very much still, even in this day and age, defined by male traits. And so that makes gendered gossip particularly harmful because it talks about women as women. And that, unfortunately, in our society makes them not leaders in many of our minds. It also taps into existing stereotypes. And so that becomes a really powerful way to spread or ruin a reputation insidiously. You don't have to be explicit with gossip. You don't have to cross a legal line. By tapping into misogynistic and racial stereotypes, you can perpetuate a narrative or ruin a reputation without ever crossing a legal line. And often the source of that gossip is unknown, so you can't take action on it. So that's another reason that gendered gossip is particularly harmful in public life. And then finally, social media, as we all know, has made almost all of these effects much stronger. And so especially for women, that experience can be an incredibly disturbing one, an incredibly brutal one. And I think what, again, we'll talk about later, but is really important to understand is because of the way social media works, the impacts don't remain online. So gossip that makes its way from the workplace online makes its way back offline, which is almost all the women in many of the research studies that I pull from, as well as the women that I spoke to, talk about real life effects, physical threats, rape threats, things that are, people that confront them in real life. And so social media has a way of creating an online and offline impact for women. So those three things make gendered gossip in particular an extremely concerning and potent effect on women in public life. So just getting a little bit into, the role of gossip in organizations, again, as I mentioned, and as you'll see in a lot of the research, gossip is not always mentioned first and foremost in organizational change. But really, when you think about it, it's very sort of illogical that we treat it as silly in the workplace when in the rest of our lives, gossip is exceptionally present. And not always negatively, right? We talk about our family, we talk about our friends, we talk about how they are and how they're doing. We also talk about public figures, we talk about famous people. That sort of discourse is exceptionally common in human life. It's part of the way humans work and how they navigate the world and understand the world, but we often treat it in the workplace as something that should be largely ignored. And it is, you find in all the studies that it is largely ignored by leadership, that leadership is very focused on official channels and spends all their time on official channels, and basically says these unofficial channels aren't worth spending time on. But in fact, as I think we talked about at the beginning of this, what an organization does not confront will be explained for them. And so unofficial channels of communication are just as powerful, if not more, in an organization. And gossip itself uses implicit and explicit threats in order to preserve and protect and perpetuate organizations. So that implicit threat can be the gossip itself. An organization that gossips a lot communicates to its employees that you will be gossiped about. You will be discussed, and sometimes it indicates what will be discussed around you. And also hearing, somebody could confide gossip in you and make that feel like it's a trusted relationship, but by conveying that to you, they're also conveying that they will convey information about you to someone else. And so gossip is sort of an implicit way to control or influence or even threaten colleagues. And then it's also explicit, and it's very often explicit in a social media world. So if you have a private meeting and the substance of that private meeting is immediately posted online, that's an explicit threat. That's telling you if you have a dissenting opinion, it will be shared and you will be humiliated as a result. And so there are very significant consequences to the way gossip percolates through organizations, and especially in a world where almost everything we do is online or at least electronic. It can be spread exceptionally quickly, right? You can have a group chat or a Facebook group where information, rather than having to go to person now, goes to everyone immediately, and then often to the public immediately, who may not even have the full context or organizational understanding. And the research also shows us that gossip is more important in hierarchical, tight-knit, and myth-based groups. These organizations share traits in the military and in law enforcement, and those organizations are also male-dominated and change-averse for the large part. And so that's not a coincidence. And so understanding gossip's role in this and how it might prevent people from rising into leadership is exceptionally important, because these are all intertwined concepts. An organization that is a hard time changing is also an organization ripe with gossip, as we will find out in much of the literature. And there are real sociological and anthropological reasons for this. Gossip is a known way that people deal with change, anxiety, or uncertainty. It's a way that they enforce group norms, protect the group, and often explain things that may be unknown or uncertain by creating a narrative that relieves that anxiety. And then again, this is important for everybody here who's a leader, because that means that gossip is going to be more frequent and more negative during times of change. And it's going to be more frequent on the agents of that change, because change is a source of anxiety, and anxiety is a source of gossip. As leaders, we should all be acutely aware that this is going to happen more often in organizations that are change averse and that are going through major changes, and that gossip will be largely focused on the agents of that change, or you could say the perceived agents of that change. And I think one thing that's really important to understand, that's an unintended consequence of well-intended diversity efforts, is that often organizations change or move to change all at once. And so they may be making major policy changes at the same time that they're bringing in new people to the organization, lots of firsts, the first woman of color. And that's a great thing. But what executives often don't realize is that means that the weight of that change and the anxiety of that change is also uniquely focused on those agents of change who tend to be uniquely not look like the rest of their organization. And so there may be a burden they're actually placing on these new leaders that they bring in that they're not aware of. And so that's, I think, exceptionally important for us as executives to understand as we go through that type of change together. And then, as I mentioned, gossip is an exceptionally powerful way of spreading biased sentiment without crossing legal boundaries. There are many examples where people have crossed the boundary and they do get in trouble, but gossip is a way of tapping into existing stereotypes and not having to cross that boundary. And so in many ways, it can be more insidious because it can persist. It can persist for weeks, months, years, a lifetime of an organization, whereas certain more offensive comments, while terrible, may be able to be stopped. And so gossip plays its own unique role in perpetuating these stereotypes. And a couple examples I'd like to give of this. So one is Marines United, which was an unofficial Facebook group that was closed just to members of the Marine Corps to discuss, Marine Corps life. And right around the time that the military was considering women in combat positions, Marines United began posting naked and sexually explicit photos of cadets online. And not only were they posting these online, this was a very aggressive act. You know, they crowdsourced these photos. They actually put bounties on certain people, photos of certain people that they wanted, including male cadets who had raised objections to this. They would put bounties out for pictures of their wives. And so, you know, they're obviously, in this case, crossing a very substantial legal line. But I think what's even more important to point out is that this is not just the action of a bad actor. Whether or not these men realize it, by doing this the very same year that the Marines are contemplating whether or not they should have women in combat positions, which was very controversial within the Marines and was pushed back against by the Marine Corps leadership. They are sending out a threat to the women who might consider going into those positions. They're sending out a threat, obviously explicitly to the women that are featured there. They are, putting them in the public sphere in a way that can never be taken back. But they're also saying to all the women in the Marines, think twice before you challenge the status quo. This could happen to you. And maybe even most significantly, but least talked about, they're saying something to all the women who might ever think about joining the Marines, that this is something that could happen to you, that you're not welcome here, and that if you come here, you will never be safe. Often these photos came from romantic partners, pictures that had been taken in a safe space, and because of these bounties were eventually made their way online. So this is an example of something that can start as gossip. It becomes, an incredibly explicit threat to agents of change within an organization, and so often women in these male-dominated organizations. Another example of that was very recently in the news is the NYPD had an unofficial site of a similar nature. It's called the NYPD Rant, and was recently exposed that one of the main authors of that rant that had been posting very anti-Semitic, racist, misogynistic comments was actually the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Office within NYPD. So again, as you can imagine, this is the person charged with combating discrimination in the NYPD, and he is writing these things online. It was also almost certainly not unknown to people in the organization, either that he was writing that or that he felt that way. So when we talk a lot about, these opaque organizations and why they don't change and what else we can do to create change, I think these are really important examples of why people inside the organizations are often silenced and are often deterred from reporting this behavior and deterred from suggesting it be changed, because throughout the course of their day, they are getting implicit and explicit threats via these gossip mills in the office, that it's not safe to speak out, and it's not safe to suggest change. And then one thing I would just say, those are obviously two very concerning and inflammatory and clearly illegal and unethical examples, but both of these organizations, among many other public safety organizations and actually technology firms and other male-dominated space, have dozens of websites devoted to gossip within their organizations. And many of those websites don't cross that legal boundary. And I would argue that they are just as insidious because they do swing these biased sentiments on this website, but they do it in ways that don't cross the line. And so they do continue to perpetuate. And so, the worst cases of this obviously have a really terrible impact on women throughout public life, but even the less offensive versions of this are having just as critical of an impact within the organizations, because people within them know that these sites exist and that what they say in the office will be put on them. And so I think it's a really important thing for any executive to understand that, the gossip mill, as it were, and still is in organizations between people, has really moved online and is really quite coercive to employees and is particularly focused on agents of change. And those agents of change are largely women. So, why women, I think, is one of the key questions. It certainly doesn't mean that there is not concerning discourse around diversity in all areas of public life, but there is some very specific reasons, and there's very specific evidence that this is actually focused uniquely on women, and particularly on women of color, and that there are some reasons for this. And one of the biggest ones is that there still in this day and age, research shows that pervasive gender norms create substantial social punishment for women in leadership. And those social punishments are often gossip. It's often an inability to have influence on their colleagues and their subordinates. And the research shows that that effect is so strong that, even if a woman does not break a gender norm, even if she does act in traditionally female ways, say she's collaborative, but she is in a traditionally male-dominated position, which all leadership is a traditionally male-dominated position, she will still reap those social punishments. So, effectively for women, there's a double bind that they're not able to ever get out of, that simply by the nature of leadership being seen as male, by spreading gendered and sexualized gossip, you can cast women as unfit for leadership just by the nature of making them women, and particularly fitting them into a stereotypical role as a woman, a very gendered and sexualized role. And so that's one of the reasons that this is so powerful. And to emphasize that and to speak to the realm of, safety throughout public life, including international relations, this is actually now known to be so impactful that nation states like Iran and China and Russia use this against female journalists and female politicians who speak out about their policies. So those nations have realized that these stereotypes are so easy to capitalize on, that they actually make concerted efforts to spread malicious information about female journalists who write about them. And when I say malicious, incredibly malicious, deep fake videos that show these women in pornography, among many other things. So there's really an intersection between gender and this type of harassment. And this is definitely compounded for women of color, who will then face narratives that target both their race and their gender at the same time. And as we've already spoken about, social media has deeply amplified this. It's created an effect where, what is online and offline really has no line anymore. They're one and the same. And the online sphere, it does a couple of things. One, it welcomes direct impact on those women. So there's no longer a filter for anybody who threatens you anymore, as there might be in the workplace. People can reach you directly. It also means that this spreads far and wide to people who aren't in your organization and may not know you. And so you can have sort of one of the women in one of the focus groups and one of these papers described it as a tsunami effect. That one tweet she sent out, meant to comment on her work life, created a tsunami of reactions from thousands of people all over the internet who she didn't know and who didn't know her work and were probably taking it out of context. And so, the online world really makes this impact much worse for women, and particularly it moves into the real life and physical realm. These women report death threats, rape threats is the most common overall, but also things like spam attacks, trolling, doxing, really serious sort of life-altering impacts to the women online. And there's, a lot of evidence and a lot of reports that shows that women do leave public life as a result. There's recently a very prominent article about MPs in the UK, female MPs leaving at higher rates than their male counterparts. And when they were interviewed as to why, they cited the abuse that they received, the online and offline abuse, as being the reason that they left. It simply wasn't worth it anymore. And that was they saw as unique to them, that while their male colleagues did get some harassment, it was infinitely worse for the women. And a little chart to show that certainly bears out. And this is corporate pipeline. I didn't have a public pipeline available, but certainly bears out that women are leaving the workforce as they rise towards the top. And, there's a ton of research that talks about the many reasons this would be, and this certainly isn't the only one. The other one talks about sort of women's burden at home. But one thing I'd suggest is that when women say that those two burdens are too difficult to juggle, this may be making the work burden more difficult to juggle for those women. That if trying to do their day-to-day job in their organization creates a whole bunch of, psychological and physical abuse. Many of these women reports threats to their children's lives as part of this harassment. And that they have to then, if they want to do something about it, spend extensive time taking legal action. That's part of the burden we are asking women to bear as they rise through leadership. And it might be some of the reason we're seeing a loss of them, especially when you get to these top levels where women must be in the public sphere in order to be at that level of leadership. And just to give a few examples, I think of not only how bad this is, but also the insidious nature. And this is pulled from some of the women I spoke to, as well as some of the women that are interviewed in some of these research documents I pulled from. But this shows how insidious it is. So one reporter who was writing on Iran and was targeted by Iran as a result, one of the targets was, she had written a book, and after she wrote this article about Iran, she received a flood of bad book reviews on Amazon. And she knew that there was no way this was a coincidence, that that many people had not read her book overnight. But it was very hard for her to prove to Amazon that that was, part of a coordinated attack by a nation state to harass her. And so that's the way in which gossip can be so insidious, especially when it moves online. And many of the reviews suggested, that she had held views in that book that simply the book was not about. And much of it was very gendered. It was about her views on, marriage and sex and family life. Another example is a woman who had written on Russia began to have, pizzas delivered to her house, anonymous pizzas delivered to her house in large quantities. So she'd get like 100 pizzas delivered to her house. And again, that might seem silly. It might seem like a prank. But what she said was, what I knew is they had found out where I lived, and that was what they meant to tell me. And by telling me in this way that wasn't an explicit threat, it made it very hard for her to do anything about. But they had been threatening her kids, and they had been threatening her online. And then one day a pizza started arriving at her house. And she knew at that moment that they were trying to tell her they knew where she lived. Another example is a lot of female reporters report, especially those who write on cybersecurity, that when they share bylines with their male colleagues, they receive extensive threats. One of them described it as being put in a dryer and left on high for 2 days, but their male colleagues receive no such threats. And again, these threats, are always, in every example, in all of the research, always targeted at their gender. Those threats range from, again, rape threats to, pictures of them put online that are meant to suggest that they're sexual in nature, these deep fake videos where they're actually, their face is put on somebody in pornography. It always strikes at their gender. By doing so, suggests that they're not fit for leadership. And it really is women in all levels of public life. If you talk to any reporter or any elected official, any woman running a nonprofit organization, anybody who has to have a role in public life, they universally experience this. And the research bears that out, both my own and that academic research that's out there. So what can we do about this? As I mentioned, it's really difficult. Some of this is really hard to understand the source or nature of the gossip, but the research does bear out that there are some things we can do to prevent it. One major thing that the research bears out is if there are consequences for the gossiper, and by consequences, I mean judgment, social judgment for gossiping, it actually dispels or reduces the amount of gossip in an organization. So as leaders, we should be modeling that behavior, and we should be aware of it. We are all human. We all have gossiped. This, is not a statement of that we've, shouldn't be doing this ever, that we've never done it, but we should think about in our role as executives, how that's different than in our regular lives. And we really should model it. When gossip is passed to us, we really should say something. And especially when that gossip perpetuates biased stereotypes, we really need to be saying to the employees that convey that gossip to us that, that it isn't okay, that there is judgment for being a gossiper in an organization. The next step is, taking swift action on behavior that breaks rules or regulations. And again, that may seem simple or obvious to most of us as executives, but I'd say one, it's not always obvious. And two, some of the examples I gave can make it really hard to know what to take swift action on. And so like that example of the woman who got the pizzas delivered, if she showed up to HR, that is probably not a complaint that would make it to the top of the pile. She would have a hard time explaining or even linking why that was part of an overall campaign of targeting against her and why that was in fact an explicit threat. And so we need to, I think, take an additional step when we're talking about these sorts of insidious gossip type of campaigns and really try to consider the whole context in which those women are experiencing this in order to make sure that we're taking action on the things we can take action on. The other piece of this is there are a lot of things that are hard to take action on, again, because of the way our laws and rules are laid out and the way social media works, and those two things have not caught up to one another. Sometimes we can't do anything about it, but we should at least be, as executives, speaking out. There are a number of initiatives that look to strengthen these social media rules and laws, and as executives, we should be supporting them because it shows that we understand what women are going through and that we want to support change in that. Next, provide external resources for combating online harassment. So again, a lot of this can't be controlled by the organization. Often the people doing the gossiping don't belong to your organization, and so you can't punish them. But there are a number of legal sites and other types of websites that actually will help women, whether it's conceal some of their personal information, like their home address, or actually help them take legal action against these social media sites. It can be exceptionally overwhelming if you get 1,000 death threats in a week, and each one you have to complain to that social media site about separately. So there are a number of firms that will actually take on this work for women, actually protecting their personal information and combating some of this harassment online. And as employers, we really should think about providing those resources to both any woman in a public position, but also any woman who is subject to this sort of gossip in our organizations or as a result of her role in that organization. Taking proactive steps to communicate about female leaders. This is exceptionally important for two reasons. One is, as we see in the research, female leaders are viewed differently, and they are often viewed negatively. And often the most negative things about the organization will accrue to the female leader and the positive things will not. And that's proven out by all of the research. And so we really have to think differently about how we promote our female leaders. We often promote them the same way we promote the men. And it takes a little bit of thought to realize that even if we promote them at the same way we promote the men, they will not be received the same way. So it takes a more subtle and more proactive approach to ensure that we're putting women out there in a way that they are receiving, positive feedback for their work, and that they're seen as, not alone in perpetuating organizational change, that's part of the organization's mission and not just that woman alone. And then finally, understanding that often women are going to get back feedback, negative feedback that men don't get. They're often going to get comments about their appearance or their sex life. And so making sure that the female leader is a part of her communication strategy so that she can, prepare herself for a lot of the negative feedback that she's going to get that her male counterparts don't. And then lastly, changing organizational norms about who fits in leadership. A lot of us, when we're talking about the highest level executive positions, go by gut, but our gut tells us what's comfortable. And obviously what's comfortable is often what's normal to us. And that is largely white men in organizations at the top levels of leadership. And so, doing a gut check, bringing in additional qualitative and quantitative information, and just giving it a little deeper thought about when we're thinking about our employees and we think, maybe someone's not quite right, but we're not sure why, maybe giving that a second thought and trying to understand, what narratives are being perpetuated about those that we're considering for leadership, and trying to take a broader view on who's appropriate for executive positions. So, there's a lot else that we could do, but I think that that's a start. I'll just wrap this up before we take questions by saying, I hope that what comes out of this is that, again, this is only one piece of a larger puzzle of reform and change and efforts towards diversity, but they can't be unpacked. They are all intertwined, and you will see in every case that organizations that lack diversity at the top are also organizations that struggle to change their policies and vice versa. And so it's really important, I think, to understand how this is part of the larger puzzle that we're all trying to work through, and for executives who want to see this change, really making sure that we take this into account. I also think it's really important to understand that, outside of the view of the executive, women and women of color are often taking on an additional burden, as you can see from some of these impacts. And we need to recognize that and understand that may be something that is, causing that woman to rethink her position, is causing her to struggle at work as she tries to combat all that is going on around her. And one thing I'm asked a lot, both in relation to this paper, but also in my life at work, is, people say, I've tried to ask, I've asked women how they're doing or what their experience is like, and they say everything's fine, or they haven't told me this, so it can't be that common. And I would just suggest that, women who have spent a lifetime rising through the ranks of any organization have internalized the lesson, which is that being weak is not acceptable, that is one of the many stereotypes they need to avoid as a woman. And so it's very unlikely that you can count on official channels within your organization or a mere conversation in order to get women to talk about their lived experience. I think it takes much greater thought in terms of how to understand and incorporate those lived experiences into your organization. But I think if you can, I think that those executives who can are going to see much greater change in the organization and be way ahead of their colleagues in diversifying their upper leadership and their management ranks. So with that, I will take questions.
So I'll start. I have to say that was extraordinarily powerful. I have a very emotional reaction to it. So thank you. And I guess congratulations for being so brave. I mean, it's, I only have a daughter, and I have a wife who, those are my two living closest people. And so this is not an issue that's uncommon to me in my life. And so, it really made a difference to me. And you may not want to talk about this, so feel free not to talk about it, but the FDNY is known historically as a male-dominated, white-dominated organization, and certainly I've been associated with it for decades, and from my perception, it's gotten much better. Your presence in your position is just a small reflection of that, maybe not so small either. Could you even comment generally on what life is like for you at the FDNY and other women these days? And also the head of EMS is a woman, which is also not usual. So anyway, and any just broad comments about life in an organization that's a quasi-military, male-dominated, long tradition, unwilling to change organization?
Sure, I will keep it broad, but I will say there is nothing that I talked about here that I haven't experienced myself. As you can imagine, that was part of my interest in writing about this topic is, and I see actually a question in the chat about defining gossip, which I actually will in a second, because I think that's important. But I think for me, part of what I was trying to do was to put words to something that I knew I had experienced, and I knew that a lot of women in my organization had experienced, sometimes because they told me, but sometimes because I could just tell by the look on their face that there was more more going on, even though they were so proud about the position that they were in and the progress that they had made. And so certainly, being at Columbia has helped me try to understand trends that I have felt intuitively, but maybe had a hard time putting words to. And I think that this is certainly one. And I would be shocked, actually, if any woman in leadership or a male-dominated profession, hadn't had similar experiences. I know I have talked to women, all over all kinds of industries, and there's a number of them, again, interviewed in the research papers that are in my bibliography, and they all reflect the same thing. So I think there is certainly something that is going on either behind the scenes or even outside of the organization. I think that's important about understanding this here is gossip in the realm of an online world happens not only within an organization, but also, outside of these organizations. But for the women, there's no difference, right? They're being harassed, or they're being told these things about themselves, either by people within their organization. They're often people with no association, but the burden is the same, right? And the effect is the same. And I think I'll actually speak to the point of sort of defining gossip. And I will say, there's a lot of literature about many forms of discourse, and you can, get into, I could write a 100-page paper, right, about all the types of discourse, the different ways gossip works. In order to keep this succinct for the sake of this presentation, and I'm actually going to read from this, I used a definition of gossip that was in a paper by Rick Delbridge, who's actually, somebody who's I have actually spoken to since I wrote this paper, and is exceptionally helpful on this topic. And it's the definition is the following: the process of informally communicating value-laden information about members of a social setting. So it's a little bit broad, but I think that the things that define it is that it's value-laden. I think that's really important. It's not mere gossip about, say what color somebody's shoes are that day. It's trying to communicate a value that either a certain person is or isn't acceptable, or a certain change isn't or isn't acceptable. And it's trying to communicate that in relation to the organization. So it's trying to explain something the organization is struggling with, but maybe is not being fully explained by the organizations, or the members don't feel that it's being fully explained. And so what they do is they create a value message about that change that they define, and then they pass that on, and it's meant to shape the narrative and shape the conversation. And you see these most commonly in the research. The ones that are most effective are the ones that shape important changes in the organization. So so-and-so's shoes were a different color this day than yesterday. Those narratives don't go far. It's the ones that seek to explain organizational change. And diversity is often an organizational change. And so these narratives are highly focused around anti-diversity narratives when they make it into the world of gossip.
Val, do you want to read a couple of things from the chat? It might be.
Yeah, absolutely. So following up on that, as a leader, what are some of the best strategies to combat and respond to workplace gossip? And I think we can combine that with how do we motivate the leaders of male-dominated organizations and companies to change? And so entrenched, it seems like it will take another century to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, so I think, the strategies I laid out, I think are really important. They can seem minor, but they, those that have been afforded to me have been exceptionally helpful. And that is relayed by a lot of the women in this. And those are laid out in my paper. So I'd encourage anybody to grab a hold of them and make them your own and implement them in your own organizations. But I'd also just say, I actually think that bringing attention to this might be the biggest thing of all. Like I said at the beginning of this was something I'd sort of known or experienced, but even I couldn't put words to. So I didn't know how to tell my own boss kind of the experience I was having. And so I think recognizing that unofficial discourse, of which gossip is one means, is present, it is intentional, and it has specifically is used to deter women. So I think actually knowing that is maybe the first and most challenging part. And I would say, you know, as I wrote this for leaders, right? I wrote this for executives. So I'm hoping that it does go to male executives and organizations, that they do look at this and think about, rethink how the women sitting in front of them may be experiencing organizational life. And I do think, one of the parts of a common feature of many women who rise to leadership is an incredible toughness, and it's also having ignored many of these things over the years. And so they are very unlikely to sit in front of their boss and tell them anything that might make them seem victimized. And often they don't feel like victims. They just don't like what's happening and they want it to change. But it can be a real struggle. So I really do think the first challenge is trying to make them aware that this is happening. And hopefully with leaders who are at least desire to change, but maybe haven't found all the tools, they can look differently at the women around them and try to understand that this is almost inevitably part of their lived experience, having gotten where they are.
I want to get to everyone's comments. I know we're running low on time, but Emma Pinter has written in a little bit about her own experience as county commissioner. I don't know, Laura, if you had the chance to read her comment.
I can look at it real quick.
So she often struggles to explain to her male peers how we tackle hard topics, such as when we work in oil and gas regulation. So maybe Emma can jump on really quick.
Yeah, hi guys. Sorry, I had to do 2 steps to get my video on. Thank you so much for this presentation. I put a couple things in the chat. This is something that I've experienced, but other than sharing anecdotes with my male colleagues, it was hard to articulate how pervasive this was. And it wasn't just me, it was other women and women of color in our workplace. And thank you so much for your research. I'm not saying they're gaslighting me or not believing me, but they always brush off these instances as a one-time event versus seeing a pattern of pervasive behavior. And you have so carefully articulated all of this research and all the work that you've done over many years. I see that this session is recorded. Can I share it with the executive leadership at my organization? What's the protocol for that? Because I just think that what you've done captures what we've all been feeling anecdotally for a while.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
The session is recorded and it will be shared on our website. It will be publicly available. So once we have it up next week, you should be able to share it.
Yeah, and I really will say, that's why I chose to write about it, right? Because I've struggled with that same thing. I think one of the biggest struggles of this type of treatment is the ability to articulate what's happening and to prove it and to show that it's a big deal. That's not small. And so, that's who I wrote this to, right? This paper is written to executives who maybe want to change, but aren't actually incorporating this into their change. So please share both the paper and the talk as widely as you'd like, to the extent you think it can change hearts and minds.
Hey, Laura, just one stupid little thing from my own experience as a white male, former leader, quasi-leader. One of the things that I've used as a truthful weapon with this behavior of men is to simply say, how would you feel if somebody said that about your daughter or your wife or your mother? Is that kind of guilt or some level of guilt up, not anywhere near the recommendations you outlined, but maybe something useful in the gossip field as a way to try to deter people?
Yeah, I mean, I think personalizing it always works. I would say, though, I think that that's only effective when the comment explicitly crosses the line. And some of these words I'm not going to repeat on a Columbia Zoom, but they are in my paper. So I encourage everybody to look at the words most commonly used to describe female politicians and female leaders, and they're not pleasant. I find when the comments are of that nature, it does help to personalize it. But I think what can be so hard about gossip is there's often months, if not years, of lead up of less explicit terms that make it hard to describe to the leader exactly what's happening. And I find that pizza example sort of like the ultimate example of that kind of thing is, I think most people would laugh if someone brought them a complaint that said somebody sent pizza to my house and I feel threatened. But when you understand the larger context of these women, that they are reporting on nation states and that they believe actually these nation states are targeting them, not even just one person, it really brings to light why that kind of thing is threatening. But that's a really hard, that's a hard link to make. That requires a much longer conversation that sometimes an executive is not, either willing or able to give to his staff. So I do think that, hopefully this paper and others, and I really would encourage people actually to look at some of the articles, in particular the one called Malign Creativity that's in my bibliography, really lays this out in extensive detail. Some of the best research I've ever seen on this. And so I think, using discussions like this and references like that, you can begin, at least to somebody who's open, begin to describe, why does this eventually lead up to the explicit comment? What are all the things happening before to these women? And, try to help them see the world through the eyes of the women who work for them.
Well, we're pretty, we're a management organization, so we try to respect organization and time and schedules. So I think it's time for us to say thank you. To me, it was a truly profound experience, and I'm very grateful to you for having shared this with us. Valerie, maybe you could, as you often do, close our session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bill, Professor Emick, for making these possible. Thank you, Laura. I know there were a lot of comments that were very relevant that we just did not have the time to get to, but I think so many people can relate to this topic. So thank you very much. Again, I've said this, the video will be available next week, and I'm sure that it will be one of our more widely watched videos.
And Valerie, if it's okay, I'm just going to put up my last slide, which is just my contact information, so that anybody on here who wants to keep talking can certainly contact me to do so.
Absolutely, please do.
So definitely feel free to reach out. I know people had a lot of questions, and I'm happy to keep talking about this.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Bill and Valerie, for setting us up.
Well, great job. Wonderful. And we'll see you all back at Food for Thought, hopefully pretty soon.
In the next coming weeks, yes.
In the next coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great job.